Hello, hello. Good afternoon, everyone. Hello, hello. My name is Jennifer Steinhauer, and I'm Senior Director of the Institute of Politics. On behalf of the IOP and our partner today, the International House, I want to give a warm welcome to all of our students and also to our alumni who are here today. Thank you for coming. Every April, we at the IOP bring some of the best reporters from around the United States and beyond to talk about their profession in an event dedicated to the memory of David S. Broder, a titan of journalism whose career began here at the University of Chicago. Known for his ability to cut through the noise of punditry, Broder focused his attention on voters whose voices might otherwise have been drowned out during campaigns. The IOP is proud to know the Broder family, both as our benefactors and our friends. I spent my entire career dedicated to uplifting journalism, and that's why I'm so proud to work at the IOP, where defense of the First Amendment is central to our mission, which is to encourage a passion for public service, meaningful dialogue, and active democracy work among our students. Rebuilding a vibrant local news ecosystem and upholding all press freedoms will always be part of the remit of the IOP. I am now so pleased to turn this microphone over to Ava Herrick, a second year in the college from New York City who's double majoring in public policy and sociology. Ava is an editor at The Gate, an IOP in-house publication. She and her colleagues have provided the most stellar leadership The Gate has ever had this academic year, and we are proud to have them as an official sponsor of the IOP Journalism Week. Now, please welcome Ava to the stage to introduce our spectacular slate of speakers.
Thank you, Jen, for the introduction. I'm very excited to be here today to introduce the capstone event of the IOP's Journalism Week. In my role in the Gate, I've had the unique opportunity to report on the ground at the most recent Iowa caucuses and the Democratic National Convention, which exposed me to the captivating world of political journalism. After experiencing the power of the free press up close and seeing how the Trump administration has upended norms when it comes to media in the White House, I'm excited to introduce the outstanding group of panelists joining us today for this important conversation. Annie Linskey is a White House reporter who has worked for the Wall Street Journal since 2014. In addition to the Journal, she covered the Democratic Party during the 2020 presidential campaign for the Washington Post, was the lead reporter on the Democrats for the Boston Globe during the 2016 campaign, and reported on the Obama White House for Bloomberg News and Business Week. Eliana Johnson is the editor-in-chief of the Washington Free Beacon. Prior to this, she has had a long career in journalism, which includes serving as a White House correspondent for Politico, the Washington editor of the National Review, which she led their 2016 election coverage, and a producer at the Fox News channel. Zeke Miller is a White House reporter for the Associated Press, leading coverage of the president and the presidency, and the president emeritus of the White House Correspondents Association. Prior to joining the Associated Press, Zeke was a reporter at Time Magazine, BuzzFeed News, and Business Insider. Moderating our discussion today is Jonathan Weisman. Jonathan is a national editor at the New York Times and has covered every presidential campaign, starting with Bush versus Gore, as well as scores of congressional campaigns as a reporter for The Times, Wall Street Journal, The Washington Post, and USA Today. Together, they will discuss the Trump administration's increasingly fraught relationship with the media and what it's been like to cover this administration through its chaotic first 100 days. Some quick housekeeping before we begin. First, please make sure to turn off or silence your cell phones. Second, when it's time for Q&A, a microphone will be placed in the audience. And as usual, we will give priority for the first questions to students. Finally, please make sure to check out some upcoming IOP events, including Confronting Authoritarianism and Resisting Against All Odds, featuring former IOP Pritzker Fellow Genesis Davila on Tuesday, May 13th at 12:30 at the IOP, and Hassan Piker, Off the Stream and in the Flesh, which will take place on Monday, May 12th at 5:30 p.m. in the David Rubenstein Forum. You can register for both events on the IOP website. Now, please join me in welcoming to the stage Annie Linskey, Eliana Johnson, Zeke Miller, and Jonathan Weisman.
All right, welcome everybody for this alumni weekend and for Journalism Week. I'm so glad to see so many people. It's fantastic, and because it is Journalism Week, this is going to be about Trump's first 100 days, but it's also going to be about covering Trump's first 100 days. And I'm going to start this off with Zeke because. Many of you probably know the travails of the Associated Press and how because the AP would not call the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America, the President of the United States decided to keep the AP out of its very important role in the White House press corps. And I want to talk to Zeke. Zeke, tell people traditionally the position that AP has taken both in the White House briefing room and at press gaggles and pool sprays. Why is this change so dramatic given the history of the Associated Press?
Well, first, thank you for all of you for being here, and thanks, Jonathan, for that question. I mean, taking a step back, what is the purpose of a pool? It comes up a lot in this discussion. As you know, there are hundreds of journalists who want to cover the President of the United States or any other public figure. You're operating in a space-constrained environment, the Oval Office, Air Force One, a resource-constrained environment. So journalists get together and say, we're going to share our information so that we can get some representatives of the press corps into a smaller space, and they can transmit that back out. The press pool had evolved over time at the White House, but it really took on its current form about 50, 60 years ago. And has evolved a little bit since, but the Associated Press has been a foundational part of that press pool, and even was there before there was a formal White House press pool, because that's sort of what the Associated Press is as a newswire. What we do is we are owned by our members. We're a news cooperative, and we are there for the small papers and radio stations and television stations in the U.S. and around the world who can't all be in Washington, so they are members of the Associated Press. They subscribe to the Associated Press so that we are there, so we are their eyes and ears, and then ultimately, by extension, the eyes and ears of everybody else. And that was our role. We were sort of in the White House briefing room. We sat in front row center. We were in every pool on Air Force One. That meant traveling with the president. Whenever he traveled, we were covering the White House 24/7, 365 days a year. We still do that, but we do that in a very different positioning now. We're not allowed the same level of access we had previously, but that's sort of the background to sort of what AP does is we were the eyes and ears of everybody at all times.
And I don't know if some people remember, but at traditional White House press conferences, the president would almost always recognize the AP White House reporter first. The press secretary would always start off briefings with the Associated Press first. It was a central position and considered kind of the dean of the White House press corps. And I do want to talk about precedent here. The word unprecedented has been used, ad nauseum over the last 100 days. At times it is merited. But I do want to talk about the past. And during the Obama presidency, at the very beginning of the Obama presidency, there was a moment where Fox News was not invited to a gaggle. And a gaggle is when usually it's the press secretary holds a kind of a private meeting with reporters to go over what's going on in the day. It's usually not with the cameras available. Fox was not invited. Do you guys remember that?
I've heard a lot about it. I was not there for that.
I'm
that
old enough to
me.
remember this.
I remember this. Me. You remember that? Okay.
Yeah. So Eliana, talk about how does that compare? How is that similar to and different from what's going on with the pool and the gaggles now?
Well, I think there are some similarities and some differences. The similarity was that the Obama White House and Obama himself, from his time on the campaign trail, loathed Fox News. He made it very clear that he did, and he singled out the network for its viewpoint, though he was not as specific in saying, it's because you won't use a term that I want you to use. He just didn't like their viewpoint, didn't consider them news. And so he said, Fox is in the pool, but I'm not going to include them. The difference is that the rest of the pool participants said, that's not okay with us. We recognize the threat here, and we're not going to show up if you don't include Fox. So they stood alongside Fox in that, and the Obama White House eventually relented. I think the AP is in somewhat of a trickier situation, though I suspect you guys will succeed in your court battle, because the refusal to use Gulf of America is actually viewpoint discrimination. But there hasn't been, well, members of the press corps are saying they agree with you. They're not refusing to show up at White House briefings or refusing to be included in the pool in the same way that outlets did with Fox.
And I think that's an excellent point. And I wonder, Zeke, do you want your colleagues to say, if AP can't go to this pool spray, we're not going to go?
I think it's a really difficult question. There are no easy answers here. The media landscape now is very different than it was 16 years ago when it happened under Obama. And also, you're operating in an environment where all of our basic positioning is we want to cover the news. We believe in covering news. And the question is, if there is a boycott, what happens from there? Yes, it was heartening to see 40 news outlets sign a letter with the White House Correspondents Association that ranged the ideological spectrum from I think it was Huffington Post on one end to Newsmax on the other, and everyone in between is saying that what was happening was wrong. That more action like that is is always helpful. But I think every individual news outlet and the press corps collectively is trying to cover the news while also trying to at the same time protect the independence of the press corps, I may disagree with some of the individual decisions that they are making, but I understand the structures and the environment in which they are making those decisions.
Can I just add, I'm not sure, the Obama White House relented. I'm not sure how much this White House would actually care.
I was just going to ask that question. And Annie, what about that? Because you've been into some of the most heated press pool sprays. When I talk about a pool spray, it means the president, you get invited into, let's say, the Oval Office. The president is there with a world leader, let's say Volodymyr Zelensky. There are a few cameras, a few reporters. It's a pool spray because it's only a few people and a little bit of time. But what would happen, do you think, if you have one of these sprays with the president of the United States and the only people who show up are the president's supporters, One America News Network or something like that?
Yeah, no, I think, this issue is one that every news organization has struggled with since the president made that decision. And it's caused everybody to have to think really hard about exactly what is the value of being there? Why are we there? And what do you give up by not being there? And, the president, when he has these pool sprays, he does have TV cameras here. So let's just be clear about who's being removed. The TV cameras are still there. He does, that has not been a part of the media that he has been eager to shut down. So then it's the people like myself or Zeke who are the reporters asking questions. And in those scenarios, you have maybe 15 or 20 people who are asking questions, and you do want independent media in that space able to ask the president a question. I'm loath to say a question is a bad question. I've asked a lot of questions that I thought, oh golly, that didn't come out quite right. But you don't always want people who are at least making an attempt at asking about news of the day and pressing the president on his policies, rather than, your poll numbers are great, Mr. President, can you comment on that? Which is a question that has come up in the past and some of the things I've been in. So the value of being in these small, intimate gatherings with the president and having representatives of an independent media there is an enormous value. Mm-hmm. We were, it was probably one of the most interesting and surreal experiences of my professional life, and I've been a reporter for 20 years, is I was in the Oval Office during this very heated exchange between Zelensky and Vice President Vance, and then later President Trump. And, being able to witness that, I mean, the images came out afterwards. People did see that you can go on and watch the full exchange, but the place that I happened to be was next to the Ukrainian ambassador to the U.S. I'm standing right next to her, and there's no bar on this. I could look, and I did look at her notes as she's taking notes during this exchange, which she took in English, thankfully, for me and for the readers of the Wall Street Journal. So the camera isn't going to be focused on her notes, but I was able to be positioned there and see what she was writing down. And I think the cameras did a very good job capturing the reaction of a lot of the principals who are in that room. Certainly, Secretary of State Marco Rubio's reaction was very well captured, but the camera's not always on him. And I do remember, as that was going on, just watching him very closely and seeing his reaction and seeing others. And you just learn a lot about the principals close to the president. So I was very thankful to be there, even though it was broadcast live, so everybody did get a chance to see it.
Well, do you feel like if you were just sitting back in the White House briefing room watching the cameras, what would you have missed?
I definitely wouldn't have seen her notes, I wouldn't have seen the ambassador notes. She was being very, she's beautiful handwriting, and she's beautiful handwriting, and she was writing down the names of each person who spoke, and then sort of a brief synopsis of what they were saying, and then she writes down JD Vance, I took that to be her shorthand, and then starts writing his question, and then it just literally there's a long blank line, almost like sort of like in my head I was thinking like a heart monitor that just went straight. And I don't want to read too much into that without having a conversation with her, but it was part of this moment where sometimes when you're standing and watching something, you want to look around and see how other people are reacting, and to be able to see that texture and to be able to bring it to our readers, I think was important.
You were mentioning some of these questions, and I'll say it, there are some stupid questions out there. And I mean, Eliana, we've seen Carolyn Leavitt, the press secretary, bring in what she calls alternative media, alternative voices. I mean, people from anywhere from podcasters who have been actually tied to Russian media, to Jack Posobiec, who is a famous conspiracy theorist. This is not conservative media. I would not call this conservative media. And I wanted to get your take on how this is working, and what has it meant to the value of the press briefing in this presidency?
Well, I don't think the press briefing has had a whole lot of value for a very long time. It's been on camera and been used for performative, posturing by various members of the press for several years. I think it would probably be a lot more useful if it went off camera. So I don't think there's anything particularly unique about that when it comes to this White House. In terms of bringing in new members of the quote unquote media, I think that's great. It is reflective of the way Americans are actually getting information. We saw this with the White House, we saw this on the campaign trail, where it was a huge issue. Was Donald Trump going to go on Joe Rogan's podcast? The guy is I'm not even going to UFC, whatever, he's a comedian who turned podcaster, but hugely influential. And the Harris campaign has said in retrospect, we wish we would have sat down with him. Is he a journalist by traditional standards? No, but millions of people are getting their information through him. And there are many others who don't fit the traditional definition. Megyn Kelly had this debate with the New York Times in a podcast. It's on video that I highly recommend about what does it actually mean to be a journalist. But I think it is reflective of a strong feeling among the American public, I assume not particularly well reflected in this room, that the American people have lost faith in journalists and journalism, quad journalism, and they are seeking out alternative sources. And so good on the White House for bringing them in. We're not doing we don't do brain surgery. Like it's not that hard to do this. So I think that's good.
If I could just add one thing to that, I think it is a little bit inaccurate to think that just because the president is getting a question from a conservative reporter, that it's an easy question. I mean, you can see some of any politician, some of their worst moments, honestly, are when they believe that they're taking a friendly question and then they say something or go off in some bizarre direction or they say something they didn't want or mean to say. So I think for me at least, the differentiator here is in my belief is you want people in there who are asking, tough questions, wherever the ideological spectrum comes from. And it's the idea of sort of sycophancy that I sort of cringe at. But I will say, in my experience at least, and the two of you have covered Trump for much longer than I have, is he doesn't tend to like that. He tends to like questions, and he tends to like having a more honest exchange with reporters, a tough back and forth that doesn't tend to bother him in many cases. At least that's what I've noticed.
In my experience, I mean, he liked that conflict. I mean, it was a central feature of that 2015, 2016 campaign. Those long press gaggles, the press conferences that went on and on, certainly at the White House, all through COVID, and even since. He likes that rough and tumble. If I just go back a little bit to Eliana's point, in defense of the White House press briefing as it exists, I will not, it is a very small part of what journalists do every day. It's, 10% of our time, and probably in terms of our work. There is the symbolism of that, whether it be on camera or off camera is a different question, but that the representative of the President of the United States, and oftentimes enough the President of the United States themselves, has to sort of abase themselves and take questions from the likes of us, and on behalf of the people who can't be there. And that is that doesn't happen everywhere on Earth. And something also, for that matter, the White House pool, as it was formally constructed, didn't happen anywhere else. No world leader in the world had 13 members of the independent press corps who they didn't pick and choose from, who they didn't necessarily particularly like, and they brought them everywhere, whether they went to golf, they went to a major overseas summit, they went out to dinner, they were just sitting around at the White House all day. They have a press corps with them at their beck and call should anything happen, and they're documenting their activities for history. That doesn't happen anywhere else, and that's there's a sort of a uniquely exceptional piece of this that some of it has been eroded in parts with the pool, but when it comes to the daily White House press briefing, how useful it is or not is not necessarily the point. It's the point of having a press briefing, of having to take those questions. I think is something that I wouldn't They may not produce a line in a story I write, but I think I'd be hard pressed to argue that they should go away entirely.
Right. Annie, I want to talk about the last presidency and your coverage. Annie, along with her colleagues Rebecca Ballhaus and Emily Glazer and Siobhan Hughes, famously covered the Joe Biden's mental slide and physical slide. And the first stories that the Wall Street Journal published were roundly criticized, not just by Democrats, but by some in the media itself. And I want to ask you what that said about the White House press corps. And then I want to talk about what would happen if you wrote the same stories today about the current president. But let's talk about first, what lesson did you and we learn about White House coverage from the response to your first story?
So I wrote with my colleagues. We wrote a story that published before the first presidential debate that documented ways in which President Biden at the time was having some mental difficulties in some meetings. And the sort of reason that we decided to do the story after the Robert Hur's report came out, special counsel, he wrote a report and it documented, to me, reading it, I was very alarmed by what I read. and our editors were as well, and we wanted to go further and find people who met with the president in small meetings and get a sense who had some sort of sense for his mental acuity. The White House had long said to us, President Biden, when he would have various snafus in public, they would say, if you could see him the way we see him, behind closed doors, in the Situation Room, he is so sharp. But you don't get to see that, but if you saw what we saw, you would have a very different view. And so, that was in my head, at least as we were working on these stories, that was sort of the thesis we were trying to test.
Challenge, right?
Yeah, okay, let's find out who gets to meet with him in these meetings and what's their view. These are people who don't work for the White House, but Democrats, Republicans who came in to meet with him. And they did report to us, and we reported in our story that, he would have good days and bad days. He stumbled frequently. He overly relied on note cards to say very obvious things, even just sort of greetings, that he would lose his train of thought frequently, that he would close his eyes even for long periods of time, that he would pause for extensive periods of time, sort of mid-thought. And that people found alarming, but they also would say, we could have one meeting with him one day and he was off and then he was okay the next time. So I thought maybe it was me. Maybe he just was having an off day. So the people who met with him even were very eager to sort of rationalize away some of the behavior they were seeing. We captured that in a story that ran in the very beginning of June. Jonathan is right. The White House was they certainly pushed back very hard. The White House official accounts tweeted at the Journal 80 times within the period of 2 days, which is kind of harassment level tweeting about how terrible I was and our newspaper is. And we sort of expected that. I was a little surprised by the media reaction. I did my first 10 years in journalism in local reporting. When you get beaten on a story, at least I tend to just have to sort of put my head down and go out and try to match the story, which we really expected people to do because it was laid out in a fairly easy way to match it. But not all, but some of the press instead really focused their coverage on the controversy around the story. And that became the story and the narrative in Washington that, even to where I would go to, I went to a party in Washington, this very fancy, glamorous party in Washington. And people kept walking up to me and saying oh, the White House is mad at you. Are you okay? As if I had cancer or something. I was like, I'm fine. I love this. This is an important story. We're still working on it. We're doing a follow-up. But personally, it was a tough period. And fortunately, the Journal was stood strong. The editors knew all of our sourcing, and they didn't waver at all. In fact, they immediately put us on another story about Biden abroad, and we pulled in our reporters from around the world who had contacts with foreign governments who he had met with to do sort of another story based more on his interactions abroad. And that story came out the day after the debate, but we were working on it. And the night of the debate, I think people changed from sort of covering our coverage and started working on their own versions of that story. Right. And the Times and the Post later did pieces that got at his decline.
Eliana, what do you think of the way other White House reporters, other media responded to that first Journal story?
I was not surprised in that I think, at the Beacon, we'd just been, we talked about something very specific in terms of Trump's exclusion of the AP, but there's all this there are a lot of arcane access issues that are not particularly fair. So, we don't have a congressional press pass. We don't have a White House press pass. We were just watching the guy on TV. And we started a series, Joe Biden's Senior Moment, on video in 2021 or 2022. And there was never a week where we didn't have multiple moments that we were displaying to people just based on TV. And so our view was, all right, mainstream's picking this up. There was one other reporter who was doing it other than you guys. We'd been observing this. I was totally unsurprised to see the mainstream press circling the wagons around the White House. But I covered the first Trump White House at Politico. And I think if you haven't been a White House correspondent, it's sort of difficult to understand that while these people are supposed to be competitors, like you guys should viciously loathe each other, that it's actually one big group of people who are basically friendly with each other, socialize with each other, seek each other's approval, basically write for each other, and this includes CNN and MSNBC and the New York Times, the cable networks and the mainstream media outlets. And so it's actually quite difficult to get out of that bubble and write something that implicitly criticizes the work of your competitors. And the result is a flow of information that is oftentimes doesn't serve the American public because it reflects one point of view as opposed to 27 points of view.
Well, let me ask you this. I'll ask both of you, all three of you, if somebody wrote a story saying that Donald Trump is losing mental capacity, how do you think the press would respond in that case?
I mean, I think it depends on the reporting here. I mean, this is not, at the Wall Street Journal, we have, we're not of Washington, right? The Wall Street Journal is based in New York. Our readers are, the sort of DNA of the Wall Street Journal readers are business people who use our information and use the information that we publish to decide on billion-dollar bets on companies. So they're not super interested in like groupthink, and they're not paying the subscription for like an ideological position one way or another. I mean, our editorial board is separate. They certainly have a conservative point of view. Our coverage of Trump has always been tough. I mean, we were the ones that broke the Stormy Daniels story and won a Pulitzer Prize for it. That is a story that ultimately led the president to have convictions, criminal convictions. So, we're going to follow the reporting wherever it goes, and we have a track record of either administration being really tough on it. And, you can see the president tweets about the Wall Street Journal, and Elon Musk tweets about the Wall Street Journal quite frequently.
Zeke, do you think that the press would circle the wagons in defense of the White House today, or is there a more reflexively critical attitude towards the Trump White House compared to a Democratic White House?
I think we need to be precise in our terms here. I think there's the ideological press across the spectrum that when their party or the preferred person is in power, they might have a very different tone, and then there's the nonpartisan press where our job doesn't change from 11:59 a.m. on January 20th to 12:01 p.m. on January 20th. When the president changes, when they take the oath of office, like that our mission doesn't change, who we're trying to serve doesn't change, the stories we're trying to write, the attitude we bring to sort of uncover the truth and share that with our readership doesn't change. It's hard for there would be a different dynamic, certainly, just where certainly from which side of the spectrum things would be coming from, but I think from what I can only speak for the AP, like our attitude wouldn't change.
Eliana, what do you think?
I mean, this is like the least hard question that could possibly be posed. If somebody wrote a story saying Donald Trump's mental capacities are diminished, you would not face criticism from your peers. I mean, period, end of story. And it's not hard because most reporters are Democrats. Their sympathies are with the Democratic Party and Democratic politicians. And I mean, the way that I put it, and this is why it's good to have reporters from both parties, is, I'm Jewish, there's a Yiddish phrase, it's just that when there's a Democrat in office, reporters don't feel it in their kishkis to really go after them, let's get these guys. How else do you explain that it took a national debate with the President of the United States basically having a meltdown on stage for the press corps to start writing this story, and then they turned on a dime, and everybody was writing it, and then he dropped out of the race, and we haven't really heard anything about it since. Now, our beef at the Free Beacon is we say we're coming from a conservative perspective. Our frustration with the New York Times and those folks and the rest of the world is just admit it, guys. Like, you didn't write it because you didn't want to, because you don't feel it the way we do about the Democrats. You don't feel it about the they don't admit their ideological priors and say
Well, I will say one thing, that if you go onto certain social media sites, you will get all sorts of people saying, why the hell don't you write about Donald Trump's decline? I mean, there are people certainly who think that that. I mean,
these are two very different presidents, right? I covered all 4 years of Joe Biden, all 4 years. And the Wall Street Journal, because we have a newswire, Dow Jones, we're also included, or we used to be included in a lot of the polls. So we were always with Biden. A lot of people, even in the White House, did not realize that because he made such little news that people were surprised that we were in these, that we were always in the poll. But we also had that sort of very privileged position. And, it is a very different experience to be in a Oval Office exchange with Donald Trump and with Joe Biden. And
How so?
He is, so when you walk in, there's little tricks. There's little tricks to the game here. And I'm really interested especially what you think, Zeke, because you've done this a lot as well. But your goal when you go in is you want to get called on by the president. You want him to take your question. And with Trump, when you walk in, he'll make eye contact with you. So he's very clearly reading each person in the room. And who is this person? Who is this person? And you have this instant to develop some kind of very quick rapport with the guy. And I haven't covered him for years like others, but so he doesn't recognize me. So you've got this moment, and then you sort of settle in and you listen to his spiel, and then you get to ask your questions. And he'll call on you sort of based on that little moment of interaction that you have. And so the first few times I did this, I was looking at my phone and trying to get the recording device to work. And there's all sorts of things that we do when we walk into the Oval Office. There's a whole slew of things that you start doing on your phone. You're recording it, you're making a phone call so your colleagues back at their desks can hear it. And I wasn't doing this little making some eye contact with the president. And so he never called on me. And so I had to learn this as I went along. But when you get to the mental capacity, that just wasn't the experience with Joe Biden. There didn't seem to be this clear recognition. This is the person I'm going to talk to. This is the point I want to make. And sometimes when he answers a question, he calls it the weave. But when you listen to it frequently, what you know is that my sense is that he doesn't really want to answer the question. And so he's going to sort of filibuster for a little while. And that is it's not an unusual thing in Washington. So my experience with him has been quite different. With Biden, there'd be really quick interactions. Sometimes he'd be super on top of it. Other times it just got shut down suddenly and it didn't even happen. But we see President Trump sometimes. I mean, there were days that I've seen him more than my husband, who's here in this audience. You're called into the Oval Office that often. So you don't, there are things to criticize about him, and he has many critics, obviously. But my experience with him has been, he's watching in a way that I did not experience with President Biden.
Okay, so he is a very stable genius. And let's, Zeke, I want to talk about covering this role, this president, and the press's role at this extraordinary time. This has been 100 days like we haven't seen probably since FDR, and they're not really comparable there either. So let's talk about the expansion of executive authority and what role the press, the mainstream media, whatever you want to call us, has in deciding when a president has become or is becoming an authoritarian, when democratic principles really are at stake. Talk about, like, is there a line? What are you looking for?
That's not my job as a journalist, is to draw that line. And that's not how I view my role. I'm not sure, I don't want to speak for everybody here. My job is to give you all on YouTube, the information that you need to judge for yourself. And I want to give you accurate, I want to give information. I want to give it to you pretty fast so you can make those decisions quickly. I want it to be in a position where you can trust me that I'm giving you, I'm not putting my spin on it. This is what happened. This is the context in which it happened, so that you can then go and make an informed decision yourself. I mean, democracies need that bedrock of information. We're there to provide it. Questions like that, are maybe better answered in places like here in Chicago. I mean, in the academic context, or by people who study that particular question. We call them up as sources and ask them questions and interview them and quote them in stories as needed. But my job is not. There's no if he does this or doesn't do that. We don't label people. That's not our role in this democratic process. Our readers don't want that. The public doesn't want that, and they arguably wouldn't benefit from that. We're trying to, our audience is everybody who likes Donald Trump or hates Donald Trump and everywhere in between. They need to know what he's doing, and we're there to tell them what he's doing.
So we're in this situation where a president of the United States is defying court. Now you could say he's waiting for the Supreme Court to give final notice or whatever, but what happens is you can call one law professor and the law professor says, "Oh my gosh, we're in a constitutional crisis." And you call another professor and he says, "We're not in a constitutional crisis yet." Maybe somebody else says,
That's a debate we can capture in a story.
Yeah.
Is there a moment? Is there a time when journalism is actually? If you just quote three people saying we're in a constitutional crisis, we're not in a constitutional crisis, maybe we're in a constitutional. Is there are we just confusing our viewers and our readers?
I think, to Zeke's point, I think that, at least for me, what I've been struck by in the first 100 days of this White House and this administration is the way that the president is using power. And I think that's, I'm not sure, I agree that I'm not here to make a label about that, but he is using power in a way that's quite different from other presidents. And that has manifested itself with DOJ, creating this office, installing Elon Musk. And, Elon Musk was in these cabinet agencies before many of the cabinet secretaries were even confirmed. So there's an extraordinary amount of power that the White House immediately held on to. The tariffs is another example of the president, vastly expanding his power and his reach. Now, I think, whether going into what you would label it, their perspective is, look, we were elected and we're going to do something. And you've had a Democratic Party that has been bogged down by this bureaucracy and these procedures, and they see themselves as working much faster but still respecting the rules. So I think one way to look at it is to just very carefully document and write about this expansion of power that's underway right now.
It's a show, don't tell. It's sort of the foundational, the journalism 101, your first day on the beat. It's, if your first editor drills it into you, don't tell people what happened, show them what happened. That's our job.
Well, Eliana, you as you said, the Free Beacon is approaching this with an ideological framework. You're open about it. Other people might not be, but you're saying you're a conservative publication. Are we in a constitutional crisis?
I actually share their view on all of this. And I think the president has taken a maximalist view of executive power on a whole host of things. I suspect that what the courts will say is mixed, that in some areas the executive actually does have these powers, and in some areas the executive doesn't have these powers. But I think the idea that, for us at the Free Beacon, for me personally, to come over the top and say, oh, there's this debate brewing in the courts and there's this debate brewing among law professors, but actually I know the answer and it's a constitutional crisis here and it's not a constitutional crisis here. I mean, we're all learning. Like I am not an expert on whether the federal government has the authority to cancel billions of dollars in grants to universities. I learned a ton from reading the briefs. They were super interesting. I'm interested to see where this goes, and I view it as our job to sort of distill down the arguments for readers so that people can understand like what argument is happening here, and to be informed and reach their own conclusions. I think things will get interesting when the Supreme Court says X, Y, or Z on this, and the White House decides how it will respond. But I think what's often lost on the public is that we're all learning about these issues in real time too. Like we're not experts on any of this. The tariff power, like we don't know anything about tariffs.
Oh, well, we're all tariff experts now.
And that's the great thing about the White House speech too. Like,
totally.
It is the ultimate generalist role. You can make anything a White House story. You're covering a person as an individual, their family, their likes, their dislikes. Do they like broccoli or green beans? Like that's a White House story. They're the commander in chief. They're the head of a political party, a political movement. They
run academia.
They run
now.
academia to do trade policy. All the and everything is a White House story. And if you try hard enough, pretty much, and that's for me, it means no day is the same. No 2 days are the same. It's the best job that there is as a reporter. I believe that to my bones because of that. But it also means that we are all by our nature generalists. We're there, and in some ways, so are most people out there as readers. In some ways, it makes us best positioned. There's specialists on our teams who are much smarter than I am when it comes to tariff policy or defense policy or individual issues. But like my job is to talk to them and sort of distill down their expertise for the general public.
Well, I hate it when a moderator inserts his own story into a panel, but I'm going to do that right now. During the Republican primaries, I wanted to do a profile of Vivek Ramaswamy in his early days, and he was walking around telling everybody that he understood that they could cut government by 75% without Congress. And I remember sitting down with him and saying, look, Vivek, there's something called the Impoundment Control Act. The Impoundment Control Act says it's a law. It was passed in 1974. It says the government must spend what Congress appropriated. And there is another law. It's called the Anti-Deficiency Act, which says the president must spend the money that Congress appropriates on the things that it was appropriate for. And I told Vivek Ramaswamy, what you're saying you want to do is illegal. And I wrote kind of a snarky article saying that he just wants to break the law. What I didn't realize is that you could break the law. And I will say it, I think Donald Trump is breaking the law. If I was writing it, I could say it in print. I would say what DOJ is doing is a violation of two laws, the Impoundment Control Act and the Anti-Deficiency Act. I haven't seen very much of that just stated. And why not?
I think to the readers, to Zeke's point, I think DOJ and what DOJ is doing has been very well covered. I think that the impact of who they are, who is Elon Musk, what are his motivations, how has he acted in the past, his sort of tendency, his move fast and break things tendency that he started with great success in Silicon Valley and brought to Washington. I think that has been fairly well covered, and it's unfolding. And I think with this president, he's pushing the boundaries, he's pushing the envelope. But to Eliana's point, we're going to find out exactly how far he's pushing it because he does enforce those laws. Pam Bondi would have to bring some sort of action, and it's not clear that that's something that she would prioritize, which is within their discretion. So we're in this very interesting moment, and that is what makes, I think, covering the White House so interesting. But covering this White House in particular is, things are happening in ways that we certainly would not have, we're not used to, and we don't expect. But I don't think there's been a lack of coverage of Musk or the actions he's taken and the repercussions that has led to, I think that's been one of the main storylines of the first 100 days.
To Annie's point, I think a lot of what you're seeing play out is a lot of the coverage on the impacts of these policy decisions, and Jonathan's point. I mean, violating the Anti-Deficiencies Act or the Impoundment Control Act. That's not. There will be a moment for that, and part of this also is Congress has to assert its own authorities there, and we're starting to maybe see some of that happen around tariffs. But from our standpoint as journalists, we can focus on the impacts. So that's also a key component of our jobs that sometimes gets missed and lost in all of the Washington drama and covering politics more broadly. Is there are real people downstream of all these decisions that are made, and in mahogany rooms in Washington, or on the 5th floor of the OPM building. That have effects on real people, on real policies, and real programs, and our job, part of our job is to tell those stories too, good and bad, is to help people understand what's happening, what their government is doing on their behalf, and to them, and who benefits and who loses out. So, I think in some ways that side of the ledger, I think that's been the bigger priority than necessarily to that largely obscure. Congressional statutes, not minimizing them, but I think for the broader public, that's Vivek Ramaswamy didn't know that when you brought it up to him. I think
he knew.
Most people aren't Yale-educated lawyers though, so who might not know that. And focusing on the impacts, I think, is where.
And this brings up another question. I mean, in the time that we are having this conversation, I'm sure like 3 things will have broken in Washington that probably merit being written up. How do you cover a presidency that comes at you like a blizzard without being covered by the snow? I'm going to ask Eliana. How do you convey to your readers or your viewers what is important when you have so much information to impart?
I'm actually might be the worst person to ask about that, because these guys work at outlets where their remit is actually to cover everything.
But you're the editor-in-chief, so you're having to decide emphasis, right?
Yeah, so we've got 25 people, and there's just no way that we're ever going to provide people a full offering. The way I look at things is to say, what's the white space that's being left by everybody else, and how do we strategically fill this? And so for the past 4 years or so, we saw a huge opening to cover academia, which has now become a major national story, but where we developed a real strategic advantage because folks weren't really on that story. But now, we're ahead of the pack. We were covering Columbia and Harvard 3 years ago. And so that's how we sort of make decisions is, and then I think we have a little bit of an advantage covering sort of fights brewing on the right, just because it's easier to cover things when the people and you hear about things brewing on the inside there. But I look at things as just we don't need to duplicate what the mainstream is doing and covering. It's what are people missing and where can we be of service?
I mean, Zeke, AP famously has to cover everything. I mean, if it isn't on the AP wire, it didn't happen. But can you convey what is most important, or is that just not your role? And what does that mean for your readers?
I mean, we have different news products. I mean, we have the news alert, which is the 120 characters. This big thing just happened. Then there's the run-of-the-mill text story, which is it could be 1,000 words, it could be 300 words, and then there's a smaller 130 word brief, and a lot of things can just be captured in a brief. There's this is something we want to note. It's relevant, but to our audience, but it might not be A, B, C, D, E plot of the day, even going down to maybe the bottom half of the alphabet, but it's something worth noting. We write a lot more alerts right now than we have in a while. There's a lot of action happening on a lot of major news, We had actually a great infographic for the first 100 days that sort of captured the first 100 days in AP News Alerts, which I thought was really entertaining for me. But we try to capture everything, but also not everything is treated with equal weight. If the impacts aren't known, it's a statement that. What does it actually mean? Will this, is it getting held up in a court? Does it need Congress to actually take effect? It's like that's sort of where the judgment piece of it gets, how significant is something. But it's a challenge when there's this much happening. It's also, a tremendous amount of fun as a journalist because you get to get smart on so many different topics and learn about things you didn't know about and educate the public on what you learn, and that's why we got into this business when we got started.
I think we're about to move to Q&A now. I'm going to quickly let Annie answer that same question, and then we're going to move to Q&A. I mean, how does the journal decide?
Our model has changed quite a bit. We often try not to do too much of the news of the day unless we have something very specific to add to it. So I was working on a big TikTok about the Treasury Secretary and kind of machinations behind closed doors about efforts to get the president to move off of his tariffs, and was sort of actually filing that story the day that he sent out a tweet and said that he was pausing the tariffs. And I was like, oh gosh, I literally had to rewrite the whole thing all at once. I think that you guys were doing something similar based on the story you did. But it ended up being a very rich story for our readers because we had a lot of very deep reporting about where various factions were within the White House and who was talking to who, and who was trying to convince the president to back off a little bit on the tariffs. But I think we're trying not to be what the AP does so well, which they cover the waterfront spectacularly. And so we also try to pick our spots a little bit.
Okay. All right, so we're going to now turn to Q&A. I would really encourage students to ask. We'll prioritize students in the Q&A, and of course, fire away.
Hi, I'm Jacob. I'm a fourth year here. You talked a little bit about this debate over whether or not we're descending into authoritarianism, and it reminded me at the IOP here we had a fellow who was a Russian opposition leader, and she sort of very clearly said that she thinks that Trump is putting America on the same path to Russia, and in authoritarian societies, journalism isn't necessarily being a journalist is taking a stance of its own. And I'm just kind of curious, do you think that any of your outlets are potentially missing the moment here and sort of worrying about this, covering this debate, and just covering this debate as if it's a normal time instead of and missing the moment and saying that we are objectively, according to many experts, and sliding into something that is closer to authoritarianism that the U.S. has ever been?
What do you think, Annie? Missing the moment?
I hope not. First of all, I hope we're not missing the moment. We have a very big news organization, and I think, speaking from a person who's in Washington and who covers the White House, the way I try to think about the president is, as I described earlier, this idea of how does this man use power? And that's how I've also approached the Biden White House and how I approached previous White Houses. And also, quite frankly, because I did cover local news for many years, I do see some parallels between Trump and sort of a big city mayor. They behave in some ways, there are some similarities. I think that question is also one that is sort of better asked and better answered by other parts of our paper. We have an entire editorial page of people who think about that and look at that. Every administration shifts things in different ways. And Trump has this way of making changes in a way that really is abrupt. But if you looked at the first Trump administration, the tariffs that he put in place caused all sorts of consternation. Headlines, my gosh, what is he doing? This is crazy. And then the Biden administration did not lift them. So I think we are approaching him and his administration by trying to look very carefully at like what is the actual policy, like what has actually changed. If he is, we talked a lot about the press corps and the makeup of the press pool. It's one thing to kick out a member group, but there's another thing is to expand it. And so they've walked a line there that has stayed, at least in this example, where he's expanding access, and they can make a strong argument that, and this is a president who does like the press, but I think it's a question that's an important one, and that I certainly hope we're not going to look back and say that we have failed on.
Yeah, at the back.
Hi, my name's Ella. I'm a second year here in the college. And I'm just really curious, like, given the large reach that your organizations have and given the constant stream of notable news coming out of Washington right now, how do your organization strategize time and resources for certain stories? And like, how do you guys strategize what you think is important to the public?
Are you guys part of those strategizing sessions? I'm curious.
I mean, a little bit, just because we're sort of the front lines of where this is happening. Like the president does something, and our job is we're either there or we're watching the Truth Social when it comes in, and then figuring it out. So like we're a lot of this happens, sort of at the strategic level above my level, but sort of at the tactical level, like where something is is this going to be that 800-word story, a 3,000-word takeout that we'll come back to next week. It's a running conversation. There are no easy answers. And the day might start with like, okay, we're going to handle this as 130, as a quick little snippet, and then events change. So it's a dynamic process, and there are rarely objective things that are that sort of slap you across the face. Like this is a big news. It happens a lot, but it is not the majority of the things we deal with by any stretch.
Eliana, you're at the top of your organization. What is the planning process?
Our focus is always on prioritizing new and original reporting, which is a little bit different than, there was like the president did a press conference today, there were 30 reporters in the room, and that news is out there. Everybody's going to get it. So my focus is really on, if we didn't exist, would this news be out there otherwise? And that tends to be really the most time-intensive and expensive sort of reporting. So I'm always thinking that way.
Hello, my name is Bez. I'm a first year in the undergraduate school. And I wanted to ask, given how the president often, how vocal he is first, and how he often goes around traditional media sources by using social media and his direct messaging abilities, if you think that traditional media can go back to reclaiming the role of shaping the narrative and shaping public opinion, public discourse, and how they would go about doing that.
This president is unique in that he shares so much of his thinking. It's highly unusual to sort of have this much of the president's thought process unveiled right before your eyes, and that does, in some strange ways, make our job a bit of a challenge, because we often look for like, okay, what's the story behind the story? But if he's already told you that, then it's like, okay, we didn't really need to work that hard to get that. So I think for us, I mean, I don't see my job as to shape the narrative as much as to like unearth new things and find out, okay, so the president said this, but who are the last 5 people that he talked to, and what did they say, and what did he say to them, and then to try to map it back further from where the public view began. And with this president, it's just he pulls the curtain so far back. Sometimes you don't have a lot more to go, but there always is more. I mean, this is the lesson that you learn after doing this job for a long time, is like there, something very, even with Trump, who is, so vocal, many of his small asides have, long conversations that happened behind that before he said it. And that's what we're kind of looking to find out.
So what happens when the president says one thing and then says something completely different? You've seen, you've all gone through this. Not only will he say, tariffs are a beautiful thing. We love tariffs, and then we actually don't want to do these tariffs. We want to do that, and then but I never said that tariffs are a beautiful thing. I mean, is there a role for the media in calling out a lie, or is it just you just lay it out and say he said this, then he said this?
Well, you guys may have different thoughts. I think a lot of times with Trump, he has competing impulses. So yes, he likes tariffs. I personally don't like the tariffs, but he likes tariffs. But he also wants to be perceived as a deal maker. And so I'm not sure he's lying when he says, like, I'm putting the tariffs on. Oh, wait, no, I struck a deal with Japan. Like, they're not contradictory. They're like sort of competing impulses. And I think you see this the most on foreign policy, where he just said in the Time magazine interview where like he doesn't want to go to war. He doesn't want to drop bombs on people. And at the same time, he uses very like bellicose rhetoric at times. And he wants to make deals. And, I was at his summit with Kim Jong-un in Singapore when he first met Kim, and he put out, showering him with praise, and he put out an agreement that probably said the alphabet. I mean, it was a whole lot of nothing. And I was struck by when he told Time magazine in his 100 Days interview, he said essentially, they said, so will Israel drag you into a war with Iran? And he said, no. And they said, okay, so you're not gonna bomb Iran. You're not gonna go in. He said, that's not what I said. I said, we'll go in very willingly. We won't be dragged if Iran doesn't strike a deal. And I think in foreign policy, and you see it in the staff too, is where you have these competing impulses. And the guy lies a lot. But on these issues, I think there are the areas of huge import to his administration, economics and foreign policy. I really think there are like a push and pull within the administration that reflect a push and pull within the president.
And you just see it right in front of you.
Yeah.
And our job is to try to capture that and explain that dynamic as much as we possibly can. Sometimes that is like helping to categorize it. We do a lot of like in their own words and sort of like juxtaposing, they said this last week, this today, or this 5 minutes ago and this now. And just to help people understand that this isn't, saying this is, they may be contradictory, but they do reflect also, as Eliana I think put really well, the different impulses. But if I go back to the initial question about the changing media landscape, and we're not going back to the era of like people reading print newspapers every day, or over their cup of coffee, or 20 million people watching the nightly news at night. Like social media, podcasts, all this, it's an evolving industry. It's always going to change. We're not going to go back to that. I think what our role is sort of how all of those platforms need some basic foundation of objective truth, and our job is to provide that. We want to be picked up by podcasts, give them the jumping off point for their conversations, so they can debate: was this a good thing, a bad thing? Do we love it? Do we hate it? They can criticize us or not. We didn't see it that way. Whatever it may be, but that sort of there still needs to be journalism and objective journalism in this new media future we are finding ourselves in.
All right, I'm going to go to the. I know we're running outside. That was my bad. I injected my own question. Go on.
Hi, my name is Maya, and I'm a 4th year in the college. I want to build off the first question, which was, it seemed like you guys were kind of jumping around, directly addressing the issue of Trump's authoritarian tendencies. And as journalists, do you feel that maintaining objectivity makes it difficult to take a clear stand on issues that may view as threats to democratic norms based on previous administrations? And this is because I do feel that there is an agreement of his anti-democratic policies that falls on all political sides of the aisle. And by trying to stay unbiased, are you doing the country and consumers of your media a disservice?
Zeke, you want to answer that?
I think, free and open societies need facts, and our news needs to be, treated or needs to be consumed by people across the political spectrum for our societies to function. I think, this is not me speaking for the AP, but just, any news organization, I think, if we were to, say this person, X politician is a blank, or whatever the thing is, people who have a preconceived political position or view of that politician will view things, will view our journalism differently. Our job is to, certainly at the AP, is to give them the facts so that they can judge for themselves, so they can go back to their, their kitchen tables and have conversations, or dining hall tables and have conversations with friends and family and people they see at the corner store, and engage in the civic discourse. And they need, we can't, it's a very dangerous thing if, we get to a place where news is not accepted as fact, and facts are in dispute. And our job is to try to reach as many people as we possibly can with those facts. Are we going to be perfect every time? No. It's a human enterprise. There will be criticism of everything we do, and that's fine. It comes with the territory, and we're okay with that. And some of these are judgment calls, and again, we may make incorrect ones from time to time. And one of the things about journalism is, when we make a mistake, we correct it at equal or greater volume than the initial error. And that's something that you often don't see from people who come at things from who aren't in journalism. They exploit those errors for their own purposes. So it's a long roundabout saying that you raise important questions about journalism, about media more broadly, about our society. I don't know that journalism is the answer to those questions. I think those are broader societal questions. It's a part of it. And I think from where we stand and what our view is, and our role in this process is that we want to provide that baseline for civic discourse to the extent that we possibly can, for as long as we can, to as many people as we can.
Okay, we have time for one more question.
Sorry,
anyone up there? That's great.
Hi, my name is Jacob. I'm a third year in the college studying political science. And I'm sorry, another question about journalism and authoritarianism. But I've noticed not just you guys, but like media, Politico, especially, I feel, when talking about Trump's use of power, uses terms like expansive use of presidential power, wide-ranging, used maximalist. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of framed as a way of saying he's using a lot of power, and I don't know it's hard to term it, but does that describing his use of power as a wide-ranging use of power not tacitly endorse the idea that it is a legitimate use of power? And take a political stance on whether his political powers.
I use the term maximalist, but I think I would put two questions to you. Are you open to the idea that there are unanswered questions about the breadth of powers allotted to the executive branch? I think you just cannot answer that and say there are no unanswered questions about this. There will be no cases that arise because of this. That is where we are. There are dueling views within the legal community about what powers are allotted to Congress and to the executive. These are playing out. And I think we've had 3 questions, I'm sure there are many more out there, about whether Trump is an authoritarian. And I think I just struggle to wrap my mind around, do you all believe that the problem in checking Trump's power is that too few journalists are out there calling him an authoritarian, and that if those of us up here would just do that, things would be better? I don't know. I have trouble understanding that. I don't think there's a lack of fervent opposition to Donald Trump in the journalistic community, and that if folks would only, cover him more vigorously and speak out against him, that the problems would be solved. I'm surprised that there isn't more concern about a lack of journalistic rigor and, question asking about the previous administration for all those concerned about coverage of this administration. It's certainly not limited to one administration and one party.
Okay, guys, that was a good way to end this because, as Zeke said, journalism is not the answer. I mean, I just want to say to Eliana and to all of you, look, the New York Times ran a series of polls during the election last year, and if you look at each one, at the very bottom of the of all of those polling questions, there was one that said, "Where do you get your news?" And the fact of the matter is, 7% of voters, of likely voters, 7% got their news from outlets like these. 7%.
Oh, really?
So, and on that note, and to say that Zeke is correct, journalism is not the answer. Zeke, Eliana, Annie, thank you very much for being here, and thanks everybody for coming out to watch us.